Today we have someone who needs no introduction, Congressman Jamie Raskin. Thanks so much for coming back on.
I'm delighted to be with you, Brian.
So, the last time we spoke, Trump's impeachment lawyers went on to use a clip from our interview as part of their fight compilation. You'd uttered the word fight during our interview, which very clearly achieved their goal of proving that Democrats are exactly the same as Trump, who
Right.
incited an insurrection
I
at the
always
Capitol.
wondered why didn't they show that we used the word the and they used the word the?
Yeah.
It wasn't like our case for his having incited a violent insurrection against the Union was based on one phrase or one word.
Yeah.
It was an entire course of conduct. So they may as well have said they used the word Congress and Trump used the word Congress. I mean, it's silly.
Right. That among other elements, among other airtight elements of their argument, surprised they couldn't, surprised that didn't work out for them.
We'll live in history together because of that
That's
phrase.
right.
Then, because I said
Hey,
fight like hell on the Brian Tyler Cohen shows.
if it's a choice between being on Jamie Raskin's side or Trump's side during that impeachment trial, I wear it as a badge of honor that I showed up alongside you on that screen. So,
Well, I appreciate that.
so with that said, you sit on the January 6th committee. I think a lot of people out here are impatient. We've seen indictments for low-level January 6th participants, and we've heard about subpoenas and private testimonies through the January 6th committee. But otherwise, as far as the general public can tell, there's still very little we can point to, especially in terms of holding the big fish accountable. So can you give an overview of where the committee stands and what the next major benchmarks or milestones are going to be?
Well, first, let me say a word about the prosecutions, because I think that's an unduly pessimistic reading of where the Department of Justice is. I mean, 750 prosecutions and investigations and lots of people in jail now. I mean, I've got colleagues, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, who go down to the DC jail and demand the release of what they call these political prisoners. And of course, Donald Trump is talking about pardoning them. Like most organized crime prosecutions and investigations, this one is working its way up. You start with the little fish, and then they help to point you to the medium fish, and then they help to point you to the big fish, and that's how it works. So, don't forget that there's been the indictment for seditious conspiracy of Stuart Rhodes and the Oath Keepers ring. That's just one of multiple domestic violent extremist groups who operated in what I call the realm of the insurrection, the people who came in planning for a violent struggle, smashed our windows, broke down our doors, beat up our cops, and helped turn the outer ring of the demonstration into a mob riot. But you're right to point our attention to the very inside of the seditious activity on that day, which was the realm of the coup. And it's an odd word to use in the American parlance because we don't have a lot of experience with coups. And we think of a coup as something taking place against a president. This was a coup orchestrated by the president against the vice president and against the Congress. And we've not seen any criminal prosecutions there yet, but I seem to believe that the evidence is building. In any event, over on the congressional side, the bipartisan select committee on January 6th, we have made remarkable progress in terms of assembling information at every level of seditious activity taking place. And we're getting a much more comprehensive and fine-grained portrait of what happened, even though it's true, Donald Trump and his immediate entourage have been trying to sandbag and obstruct the committee. But we've won pretty much every case in court that has been filed by either side. And we have rulings at every level, all the way up to the Supreme Court, that executive privilege is just not operative for a former president trying to hide his involvement in a violent insurrection against the Union.
Now, when will public hearings be? And using your best judgment, do you believe that issuing a subpoena for Trump to testify publicly will be necessary?
Well, if we want Trump to testify, definitely using a subpoena will be necessary. As you might recall from the second impeachment trial, I sent him a letter saying that he had put into issue specific facts that we had alleged and documented in our case, and therefore he needed to come and testify to clear it up because only he could. His team rejected his participation in less time than it took him to respond to the insurrection in the Capitol. And
Which was a pretty long time, by the way.
yeah, that was 3 hours. We heard
Yeah.
back from him, I think, in 2 hours. Maybe it was an hour and 45 minutes. But
Yeah.
so we will need to subpoena him if we're going to hear from him. I think that hearings are likely to come at the end of April or in May. They have definitely slowed us down by a month or two by the stuff they've been doing. But we're going to get all the information that we need. And those hearings, I hope, will be 2 or 3 weeks of daily hearings, perhaps in prime time, or they might vary in time, but that tell a complete story of what took place, how it took place, what are the causes behind it, and then significantly, what do we need to do to prevent this from ever happening again, to fortify our democratic institutions against coups and insurrections.
Now, you'd mentioned that that you've won just about all of your court cases. Those include issuing subpoenas, forcing people to comply. If you do issue a subpoena to Trump to come and testify, is there any way that he can get around it? Is there any way that he can deny his involvement?
Well, I mean, of course, he has a right to assert his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, which I suppose he would do in the end. Now, that is a privilege that you have to assert in person with respect to specific questions. It's not a magic wand that you wave over an entire inquiry. And his executive privilege claims, or former executive privilege claims, are absolutely fraudulent, just like his claims to be able to keep secrets about insurrections and coups have no standing in law. So all that stuff is going down. I mean, it's pretty much already gone down. So it may be a race against time. We'll see. He will either get up there and tell the truth and completely convict himself of being at the center of this attack on American democracy, this attempt to overthrow the 2020 election and coerce Mike Pence into unilaterally rejecting electoral college votes, or he'll lie, he'll commit perjury. I know it's a matter of enormous frustration to the public. It's just maddening to people that he's gotten away with so many crimes. I mean, he is a one-man constitutional crime wave and old-fashioned felony crime wave too. And he travels with an army of lawyers, and he's always had his daddy's money to bail him out. But I'm with Dr. King. I think the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and it's going to catch up with him.
You'd mentioned delay tactics. Bannon didn't comply with his subpoena. He was indicted in November, and then his trial date was set for July. That's obviously a really long time. And so if the goal is delay, then that tactic appears to be pretty effective. So would the precedent of Bannon's delay be enough to dissuade the committee from trying to compel Trump to appear? And if so, wouldn't that be just giving the guy exactly what he wants?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of different tactics that are out there. We've tried different things. Different things are working better than others. There are criminal contempt actions. There are also civil contempt actions. There are inherent contempt actions within Congress itself. What's happening is that the velocity of participation is so powerful that a lot of witnesses and potential witnesses are thinking to themselves, I better testify because otherwise people are going to testify about me. And they're, so a lot of people are getting in it because they don't want the train to leave the station without their opportunity to speak.
Now, Trump has dangled pardon pledges for January 6 participants. How does that impact how you're approaching this on the January 6 committee? And how should the DOJ approach this separately?
Well, let's start with how America should approach it. I mean, what you have is a guy who waged violent and unlawful battle to overthrow a presidential election, who is saying his conduct was perfect and he would do it again. And not only would he do it again, he would do it again, he would get in, and then he would pardon the insurrectionists. I mean, that's quite close to being a declaration of war on our constitutional order. So that's something that primarily the American people need to take seriously. We've already seen that Donald Trump is lawless and incorrigible. We will try to get testimony from him. We will try to get him to answer questions on the record, but nothing in our strategy depends on that.
Now, the last Trump question here. A few days ago, we heard Trump admit that His goal was to get Pence to overturn the election results. He says this in broad daylight. And that's in addition to, as I mentioned, Trump openly dangling pardons for January 6 participants. Of course, his demand to the Georgia Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes, which was recorded. I've said over and over that just because you say something in broad daylight doesn't automatically make it not criminal. It just makes it criminal in broad daylight. How confident are you in the DOJ and in state attorneys general that there will be accountability? And what's at risk if we don't hold Trump accountable?
Well, you're right that if you rob a bank in broad daylight, you still rob a bank.
Yeah.
And just like if you rob a bank with a mask on, that is not more culpable than robbing a bank with taking your mask off. And
right.
Donald Trump, of course, won't wear a mask anyway. So, so all of that is true. But look, I think they're all going to get their comeuppance. I think that the public is increasingly sick of the lying. The problem is that he's been consolidating his power and control over the Republican Party, which today, voted in the executive committee to censure Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger for the crime of telling the truth. They should be censuring Donald Trump and ejecting him from their party, but instead they're trying to expel and censure Liz Cheney. What a scandal for Abraham Lincoln's party. He started that party as a party of union. He hated the know-nothings. He hated the racism. His Lyceum address was all about the dangers of mob violence after the attack on Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist newspaper editor. And he said, if downfall ever comes to America, it will not be from monsters abroad. It will be from the evil within. And he was clearly thinking about the slave power and racism in the country, the same forces, the same kind of forces that have arrayed themselves today against the constitutional order.
The DOJ is looking into the fake electoral college certifications, and that's in a number of states. It's in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, PA, Wisconsin, Nevada, and New Mexico. I know you have no visibility into justice, into DOJ, but how much criminal exposure is there for those fake electors and those who sent the certifications in?
Well, that varies from state to state, and it also depends on what specifically they were saying. Some of them were extremely nervous about what they were doing, and they took care to make provisos that mitigated somewhat the claim that they were the official electors from particular states. But others just, they just shot for the moon and they said, we are the official electors from this state. And which of course you would need to do if you wanted to contest the election and try to throw the whole thing into chaos. And that's what I believe their centralized organizers were urging them to do. So we have to look very carefully at what they said in what context to determine whether there was forgery, whether there was mail fraud, whether there was wire fraud, whether it was part of a seditious conspiracy to overthrow the election and the government.
And would that be something that's prosecuted on the state level or at a federal level?
Again, you have to look at what specific offenses are in play. I mean, there's no generalized federal offense of fraud in 18 USC, but it's mail fraud and it's wire fraud. So you can't use the US mails to deprive the public of its right to honest services. That's been upheld by the Supreme Court, that component of the mail fraud statute, just like you can't use it as a device or an artifice to deprive someone of their property. You can't deprive the public itself of honest services. So I think they're on very shaky ground there in terms of both mail fraud and wire fraud. But there are clearly state fraud and election fraud statutes that are in play. I mean, I read today about a woman who just got sentenced to 6 years in jail in Tennessee. She's in Memphis, Tennessee. She was in jail and then she was on probation and she got out. And by getting out, she thought she could register to vote again, but her probation wasn't actually over. But you can see what the confusion was. But the prosecutor brought the hammer down on her and brought a prosecution for election fraud, for voter fraud, and she just got sentenced to 6 years in jail. 6 years.
And that's one person. What's going to happen to these people who tried to deprive the voices of tens of millions of people?
Well, that's exactly my point. These fake electors, these fraudulent electors, were trying to deprive the entire public
Right.
of its right to participate in the presidential election by essentially stealing the election. That's a much bigger deal than one person voting illegally by accident.
Yeah.
Of course, she's an African-American woman, so you've got to ask other questions about what's taking place there. But if we're going to take voter fraud seriously at that micro level, which is so episodic and essentially irrelevant in terms of election outcomes, certainly we got to take it seriously in terms of people trying to hijack the entire election.
So I want to move over to you. A few days ago, on January 30th, that would have been your son Tommy's birthday. You honored him in your book, Unthinkable, Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. How are you doing? Like, are you and your family as okay as you can be?
Well, I suppose by definition, we're as okay as we can be now. I mean, I can certainly talk about Tommy without dissolving into tears and grief, which is what it was like for the first several months. I mean, I just couldn't talk about him, and usually I can do it. And, the book and all of the writing helped me to articulate a lot of different solemn emotions I've been experiencing since we lost him. But, a dazzling bright star went out in my life when we lost him. But I do believe I carry Tommy with me in my heart and in my soul. And there are just a lot of people who love him, including a lot of people who didn't know about him before, but are like reading his poetry and reading his plays and learning what he was all about. I mean, he was like a visitor from a time 500 years from now when everything's worked out all right and we've gotten beyond war and poverty and these things. I mean, Tommy used to say there was a time when there was slavery and there was a time when there were witchcraft trials and there was, a lot of brutal things took place and we got beyond them as a species. We got beyond them as a people. And so we can keep evolving, but we need to hang real tough for democracy right now because we got forces, not just in America, but all over the world that would drag us back to the worst darkness of the 20th century, the fascism, the Nazism, the racism.
I know you've done a lot of interviews about the book, and so you don't really ever get any relief from talking about this traumatic event because the traumatic event is the book. Has that been harder than you thought, or because you've done a lot of media appearances, has that been in some way therapeutic or?
No, it's been good to talk to people and to connect with other people about it. I mean, we live in an age of trauma, really bad trauma, and we're not the only family that's lost someone, in 2020. It was in the last day of 2020, but, we're up around 1 million now from COVID-19, 1 million in the opioid crisis, people we've lost, gun violence, and the mental and emotional health crisis, you name it. I mean, so there are a lot of people out there who have written me about their stories and what's going on with them. And, trauma cheats you of what's most precious and important to you in your life. But the other side of it is it connects you to people and allows you to grow in wisdom and understanding of other people's pain and sorrow. So that's all right. It was therapeutic writing my book. When I did the audio version, that was very difficult. It was very hard to read it aloud. But I have found this process of talking about it a nice thing, in terms of connecting me to other people and, in getting to talk about Tombo like that.
Well, you'd mentioned people writing to you. Was there any feedback that was especially memorable for you?
Oh man, I mean, we've got, I don't know how many letters now, but certainly more than 15,000 letters and emails. And I think about lots of them, a lot. there are other people who've lost family members in the same way that we did. People have very meaningful things to say about that and how to think about it. We've heard from a lot of people who were traumatized by January 6th and who had their faith in America shaken by what they saw on that day. And they're finding hope in seeing other people fight for America and fight for our institutions. They want to see people fighting back. And I agree, I want to see people fighting back too. I mean, this has got to be personal for us. The people that came to tear down America on that day were serious. And if you look at their websites, they're saying the only thing they regret is they didn't bring their firearms with them. They left them back in the hotels and the cars. And Donald Trump wants to whitewash the whole thing, says his rioters greeted the police with hugs and kisses, which is presumably how 150 of them ended up in the hospital or wounded or injured.
How can people who watch or listen to this help? I know you have a memorial fund. Is that the best way that we can help?
Oh, yeah. Well, we created a memorial, the Tommy Raskin Memorial Fund for People and Animals, which you can find if you check it out. It's run by Tommy's sisters and cousins and his friends. It's a kind of a younger generation thing, and they've already given away hundreds of thousands of dollars to causes important to Tommy, including civilian relief and resettlement from the civil war in Yemen, which Tommy was working on, and relief in Haiti from the most recent earthquake. And Tommy was a passionate vegan. And so a lot has also gone to animal welfare, animal rights groups. They're doing really interesting stuff, and they've raised more than $1 million, and they've been able to put it back into the causes important to Tommy. And of course, politically, I'm going to be spending this year on the project that Tommy helped me to create when he was a boy, called Democracy Summer, which is for young people to come and get involved in, not just my campaign now, but Democratic campaigns across the country. It's been adopted by the DCCC, and to learn about the history of social struggle in the country and the struggle for the right to vote and to participate, and then where we are today with all these, anti-democratic instruments, the whole bag of tricks that the GOP uses to thwart majority rule, the filibuster, voter suppression, statutes, right-wing judicial activism, gerrymandering of our congressional districts. So we study all that, and then we study what can be done, and then we mobilize the young people to go out and to register people to vote and educate people and to canvass in the neighborhood. So people can check out Democracy Summer too.
Great. I would highly recommend, if anybody's listening and has anybody they can refer that to, that would be the experience of a lifetime. So look, I can't even begin to imagine what you went through, but I can say that between losing your son and then showing up a few weeks later to be the face of the movement to protect American democracy, that you've shown more strength and courage than anyone on this planet will ever show. You're as good as it gets. So thank you for taking the time today. It was an honor to have you on again.
Well, thank you, Brian. It's kind of you to say that stuff. I don't think it's true. I see people acting with extraordinary courage every day. I did exactly what I felt I had to do. I didn't know anything else I could do. But I appreciate your saying that, and thank you for having me on.